unless the Lord keeps the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And there's two ideas there that we're going to be thinking about. First of all, the Lord as the one who keeps, and secondly, the watchman and our responsibility as watchmen and watchwomen, if you want to be a watchwoman as well. Both of those phrases, if you think about it, are to do with protection, about protecting a city and protecting the people in it. And that's the meaning behind the word. You know, this word that's used in the psalm, unless the Lord keeps the city, is a word shamar, which means, you know, we don't use the word keep in this sense these days, but we might use watch or guard or preserve. You know, it's an idea of protection. It's the very same word actually that's used all the way back there in Genesis 3 about the cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden and the flaming sword which turned every way to guard or to keep the way to the tree of life. You know, and that was there to protect and keep something in place. And this is what God is doing and what we're going to be thinking about in this first session. Now, although it crops up there in Psalm 127, that's not the first time in the Songs of Degrees that this idea of keeping, watching, guarding actually comes up. And that's why we had Psalm 121 read for us, because it's all over that psalm. So if you've still got your Bibles open, let's have a look at it. And if you haven't, now's a good time to reopen them to Psalm 121 again. Because just look, if you didn't spot it in reading just now, how often the idea and the word comes. It starts in verse 3. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Verse 4, behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. Verse 5, the Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. Verse 7, the Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. You'll notice in your margin, it's the same word again. Keep, shamar. Verse 8, the Lord shall preserve your going in and your coming out. This is the big idea, isn't it, that's in this whole psalm. For it to come that many times, even though our English translators have tried to disguise it neatly by changing the word in English. But this is what it's all about. It's about God guarding his people, God keeping, protecting each one of them. And I suppose when we read a psalm like that and say, okay, this is what the psalmist is talking about, God's protection, we may ask the question, well, I do, what's he thinking about? What's he writing about? What is it that's going on in the psalmist's life that makes him record these thoughts? Well, if you accept the idea that the Songs of Degrees were either written by Hezekiah or at the very least were compiled by Hezekiah during his reign to commemorate all the things that went on during his reign, then this psalm is one that very much dates to the time when Judah were invaded by the Assyrians under Sennacherib. So at the time of this psalm being written, Judah and even more so Jerusalem were under threat. And there was nobody there to help them, was there? As verse 1 says, I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence comes my help? Well, it wasn't going to come from Egypt, was it? They were the proverbial chocolate teapot in the time of Hezekiah. No use at all. It wasn't going to come from any of the other cities in Judah either, because as you know, Sennacherib took each one of those in turn, leaving Jerusalem on its own at the end. In fact, there came a point, didn't there, in the life of the people in Jerusalem where there was only one way that they could turn, and it was to look beyond the hills. Because as he says in verse 2, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And the level of help that the psalmist can see he can get from God, it's almost overwhelming. And it's just sort of wrapped up in the next few verses. Just think of what he says here in verse 3. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. You see, the point the psalmist makes there is it's not just that God is looking after the city, but he's doing it ceaselessly. This is absolute 24/7, isn't it? God, the way it's depicted is that God deprives himself of sleep, as if God needed to sleep, but he deprives himself of sleep so that there's not a moment's lapse in the protection which God gives to his people. And, when you protect something 24/7, then the protection you can offer is complete. And you get that in the next couple of verses, don't you? Where he says, the Lord, verse 5, is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. These are lovely poetic verses, really, aren't they? Because that's the psalmist kind of saying, there's not a single sunbeam can break through. Not a shaft of moonlight is able to break through this cover, this shade which God protects. This is no English day, is it, where you might get a bit of sunlight over there while we're under the clouds here. God is a shade that's absolutely ironclad. These images, that the psalmist puts before us, they're ones that when we read through Isaiah, we find are quite familiar there, because he writing at the same time, writing about the same events, not surprisingly, uses the same kind of pictures. This is one that he uses quite early on in Isaiah 4, where he says, the Lord will create above every dwelling place of Mount Zion and above her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a covering, and there will be a tabernacle for shade in the daytime from the heat, for a place of refuge, and for a shelter from storm and rain. That's brilliant, isn't it? And you can see, actually, can't you, in the words he uses, Isaiah's thinking back to the Exodus, isn't he? He's thinking back to the pillar of cloud and fire, which as Israel walked through the blazing desert heat, provided this lovely shade over them all to keep the bright sunlight out from burning them and making them weary. And Isaiah says this is the kind of protection God will provide around his people now as well. It's all-encompassing. Let's have a look at another one. I'll get you to turn to this one if you will. Isaiah 27, because this is another key passage that shows you how just thorough this guarding was that God gave to his people. Isaiah 27. It's all, quite symbolic language again. Verse 1, in that day, the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he'll slay the reptile that is in the sea. This is about the destruction of the Assyrian hosts. And then verse 2, in that day, sing to her a vineyard of red wine. I, the Lord, keep it. I water it every moment, lest any hurt it. I keep it night and day. There's that word keep again, used twice there in verse 3. This is the protection that God gives. And you've noticed there, he's talking about God having a vineyard. He's got these lovely vines. And he provides there 24-hour care for it. I keep it night and day. Now, Mary will tell you that we have 2 vines in our garden. She's got the white grape one. I've got the slightly more recent red grape one, and the best I can ever do is look at it and ask her if there's anything she'd like to do to help with it. I really don't keep it at all. But this is awesome, isn't it? He keeps it night and day, watering it when it needs watering, and getting rid of the stuff that might grow up and choke it as well. Because verse 4, he says, fury is not in me. Who would set briars and thorns against me in battle? I'd go through them. I would burn them together. And that's pretty much what God does, isn't it, to the Assyrians when those briars and thorns come up against his beloved vineyard. That's the level of keeping and protection which God has. And you've got these lovely images that the scripture gives us to just help us picture it for ourselves. So come back to Psalm 121 again. And having given us all these images, whether it's of God not sleeping, or whether it's God providing, cloud and shade for his people, or protection for his vineyard, the way the psalm ends is to say, look, this is what I'm talking about. This is the literal side of God's keeping. Verse 7, the Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth, even forevermore. And that's what it's really about, isn't it? That God has been talking about, and the psalmist has been speaking about all the way through this psalm. It's about delivering his people from the danger that they were in. It's about saving their lives, not just saving them today either. Did you notice that? It's about saving them in the future. It's from this time forth and forevermore. So there's something for you and me in the words of the psalm as well, aren't there? I just want you to imagine then the psalmist who wrote this, standing on the walls of Jerusalem, looking out, and there before him is ranged the might of the Assyrian army, and the blasphemy of Rabshakeh as he comes out from in front of that army. And he looks out, and there's no cloud on the horizon of, the dust from the Egyptians coming to save them. And there's no army coming from any of the other cities in Judah to save the people. But he can look out and not worry because he's got that solid trust in God and says, I'm looking beyond that to God, who is my unsleeping keeper, the one who will preserve my soul. And it's that solid trust in God, isn't it, that you and I are being exhorted to have by such a beautiful psalm as this. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And it's the same level of trust that a later generation of people living in Jerusalem had to have as well, to look beyond their own very, very limited resources. Come back, if you will, to the book of Nehemiah and Nehemiah chapter 4. Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the city was one of the other ideas that was behind today's theme. So I thought I ought to duck into it at least once. But it's really apt, this is, because here they are, Nehemiah chapter 4, and this chapter particularly documents all the opposition which the builders of the wall faced as they set about the task, as chapter 3 tells us, in rebuilding the city walls. And we get in verse 7 of this chapter. Now, it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry, and all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. And really, the situation these people were in was even more precarious than it was back in the days of Hezekiah, wasn't it? Because these people didn't even have a wall between them and the enemy. They were still picking up the bits to try and start building a wall for themselves to keep their enemies out. And yet, they too had God keeping them. And I wonder if they had Psalm 121 in their mind as they worked away day and night, nervous, I'm sure, very anxious about who might come against them, tired from all awful hard work they were having to do to build the wall. But nevertheless, putting their trust in God that he would be with them through this. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. They all had to sleep at some point. How would you have felt if you were rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and you thought, they might attack when I'm asleep. Perhaps I better carry on working. Perhaps I better do a bit longer. But the trusting God says, actually, you can sleep because God never sleeps. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. And God did, didn't he? They prayed to God and they carried on with the work, trusting in God, and he preserved them. Now, the thing is about passages like this, brothers and sisters, we read them in our readings, and it's kind of quite easy to read them almost dispassionately, because they're just, well, the thing is, you and I know how the story ends, don't we? We know they started to build the wall and they finished it. We know that Hezekiah was besieged and the siege was broken. It's always easy when you know how the story ends. But life isn't like that in reality, is it? It wasn't like that for those living those situations. And it's not like that for us either, because you and I face challenges in our lives. We can't see the end either, can we? We don't know where these things will finish off. And sometimes it can feel quite insurmountable, can't it? What we face. Maybe it's health issues. Might be financial worries. Might be work problems. Might even be ecclesial problems. That's perhaps the most challenging, isn't it, of all? It's harder, isn't it, to imagine that God is our keeper, that the Lord is preserving us as our protector when we seem to be living our life in the pouring rain or under the scorching sun. If our life is open to the elements, that is very hard then to see beyond the hills, to see that there's an end out there. And maybe it's at times like that, brothers and sisters, when we just cannot see where this might end or how it might end. It's worth actually trying to step into the shoes of these people who were there in the passages we've just read and think of what it was actually like to be there in it rather than what the end was like. You imagine being Hezekiah or one of those standing looking out from the walls of Jerusalem. Your whole land's gone. That's it. All overrun. The city is now under siege, so you can't get out. Egypt, utterly hopeless. That the situation that Hezekiah and his people found themselves in, humanly speaking, was a desperate situation, absolutely desperate. And Rabshakeh thought so too, didn't he? He stood out there spouting off because, as far as he was concerned, that city was an absolute goner. And it's in that situation that the people were still able to put their trust in God. Because actually there's nowhere else, is there? Nowhere else that they could go. This is how they start the siege. With Hezekiah saying, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, nor dismayed before the king of Assyria, nor before all the multitude that's with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." Notice this, the people were strengthened by the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Not because he was a great orator, but because he told them where to put their trust, to rely on God. So in spite of all the signs to the contrary, the people in that city believed that God would be their guard. And, it was no different, was it, I don't think, in the later years when Nehemiah and those with him were rebuilding. put yourself now back in his shoes and just think of what they were dealing with. The material they were building with was rubbish. Literally. They were trying to rebuild the walls with walls that had been broken down. The task they faced was massive. That wall just went on and on and on, didn't it? And, if it wasn't that the task was massive, you've got to defend all of that wall that you're trying to rebuild. With threats from all your enemies who could come at you from whichever side they chose on whichever day they chose. Even the locals undermined you. Your own people of Judah were coming in going, I don't think you're going to do very well. Sorry if that came out with a Yorkshire accent. It's not how I imagine it. But it's, you know what I mean? It was that kind of grimness, wasn't it? But for all of that, and there's now worse, is there, than your own undermining your work. But for all that, they did not stop. And did you notice when we read that in Nehemiah, what it was they did? It doesn't say, their enemies were threatening, they were going to attack, so we just worked a bit faster and we stopped sleeping more. It says we prayed and carried on with the work. That's what they did. All they could do, just like Hezekiah's folks, all they could do was just put the cause into God's hands and say, you're the one who can keep us. And they trusted God to do so. So this is what we get out of the scriptures, isn't it, brothers and sisters? If we can put ourselves in the feet of those who were in the middle of these things and kind of, not read too far ahead, as it were, we can see that the situations they found themselves in could very easily be viewed as utterly helpless until you get to the end. But when they were in the middle, it looked helpless. But those who were in the middle of these things, they didn't see it that way, did they? They didn't look at all the obstacles and the barriers and the problems and go, it's hopeless. Let's give up. Instead, their perspective was one that recognized that even in difficult circumstances, their God was there. Because, as the psalm says, their God is a God who doesn't sleep. Their God is a God who he's not going to turn his back on them and miss the situation. He's all over it, isn't he? That's what the psalm taught us. God is all over the situation, keeping his elect for as long as necessary. Well, whether it's 52 days till the wall is finished, whether it's a year till the siege is over, whether it's forever. Because actually that's what the psalm ended with, wasn't it? The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. I want to finish with you on another psalm, if I may, brothers and sisters, because this one always strikes me as having the same attitude. And actually David recognizing what we're seeing here, that even in the middle of a hopeless situation, trusting in God can get you to the end of it. And it's actually Psalm 34. Psalm 34 is a psalm all about God keeping his elect, isn't it? And in this case, it's David thinking of his own experiences. We know from the title that David writes this after he's had a brief and unpleasant spell in Gath and has pretty much escaped, it seems, with the skin of his teeth. And he recounts in this psalm the protection that he had received from God there. He says in verse 4, I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed, presumably those of the men with him. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them. And you notice again the emphasis that you get just in that string of verses there, that people are crying to God, and God hears, and God delivers them from all their troubles. The angel of the Lord is there to provide this deliverance. That's the way that God keeps his people, but by having his angels working around them all the time. And having been granted that deliverance, he offers it as advice to others, doesn't he? And says the same will be true for you. So verse 15, he's able to say that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. So that verse 17, the righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. And you get a real impression, don't you, from Psalm 34, that, David, he's had this escape from Gath, and he's had all his troubles taken away. God has delivered. That's what he says, doesn't he? I cried to the Lord, and he delivered me from all my troubles. Well, if you read the life of David, that period of his life was really not free from troubles at all, was it? His life continued in fairly severe difficulties for a number of years yet, before he ever ascended the throne of Judah. He's still an outlaw. There's a price on his head. His own people may and will betray him. He's been chased by Saul, so he's got all those narrow escapes to have from Saul yet. There's a whole number of years of running away, living in need and want and fear yet to come. But that's not the perspective of David, is it? That's not the view he takes. He doesn't just say in this psalm, well, God just got me through by the skin of my teeth on that, but I ain't sure it's going to happen again, Don't think that'll happen the next time round. That's not the cup half empty that David is it, brothers and sisters? He recognises in this psalm he could have died in Gath, and he appreciates that God has given him deliverance, and because God has given him deliverance then he's able to trust that God will continue to be with him, to keep him, to give him the deliverance that he needs. Because he knows, actually, despite having said the Lord has delivered me from all troubles, he knows that there will be other troubles to come. It's not going to be a life of all singing and dancing for the rest of his days. And you've got that really at the end of the psalm, haven't you? In verse 19, even though he said the righteous are going to be delivered from all troubles, he says in verse 19, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He guards all his bones, not one of them is broken. And this is the long view, isn't it, that David's able to take. It's a long view that recognises he's been through one challenge and God has delivered him, massively so, but he knows there'll be other challenges to come in the future as well. And yet God ultimately is going to deliver him from every single one of those challenges that he will face. And that's because God is his keeper. God is the one who guards David. And it's the same today, isn't it? It's absolutely no different for you and me, brothers and sisters, that we are able, if we're willing to, we are able to trust in God that he will guard us from the things that he knows we need protecting from. Doesn't mean our enemies disappear, does it? The enemies didn't disappear from around the walls that Nehemiah was building. It doesn't mean that our life is suddenly a bed of roses, that it's free from obstacles and challenges and tragedies. We'll carry on facing all sorts in life, but we can face it knowing that God is there to protect in the way that he knows we need protecting. And, sometimes, brothers and sisters, people will look at our lives and they will they will think that we have a pretty desperate run of things. That as they would see it, we've been dealt a bad hand. But life isn't about chance, is it, at all? Because like all those people we've been reading about in the scriptures, whatever hand we appear to have at the time, we can go forward, having confidence in our God, that he'll bring us through the many afflictions that the righteous have, and will deliver them ultimately out of them all, because God is our keeper. As we read in the psalm, the Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He'll preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and even forevermore.